Alexander Grant's name carried weight wherever it was spoken. In boardrooms, it was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. Among rivals, it was muttered with envy. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of success, a man who had risen from the ashes of poverty to build one of the largest multinational empires in the country. Every glossy magazine cover that bore his face praised his sharp intellect, his ruthless negotiation skills, and his unmatched vision. But behind the perfectly tailored suits and the pristine image of a self-made billionaire lay a man as cold as the steel towers he owned. Alexander's life was a carefully calculated system. Every hour was scheduled, every detail accounted for, every decision made with precision. He trusted numbers, not people. His board members respected him, his employees feared him, and his competitors despised him. He never entertained frivolous social gatherings, nor did he indulge in unnecessary displays of affection. To Alexander, emotions were weaknesses, liabilities that clouded judgment. Yet, for all his control and perfection, there was one chink in his armor, his daughter, Chloe. She was the only soul who could draw tenderness out of him, though even that was buried beneath layers of restraint. Chloe was just 7 years old, a bright-eyed girl who once had a world of possibilities ahead of her. But fate had been cruel. A car accident 2 years earlier had stolen her mother's life and left Chloe confined to a wheelchair. The tragedy had carved a permanent scar across Alexander's heart, though he rarely allowed anyone to see it. Instead of healing, Alexander built walls, higher and stronger than ever. He poured himself into his empire, expanding it ruthlessly, all while shielding Chloe in a fortress of luxury and isolation. No one came near her without his approval. He hired the best staff money could buy, screening them through elite agencies with rigorous background checks. Nurses, tutors, maids, each was trained, polished, and replaceable. To Alexander, staff existed to serve a role, not to bond with his daughter. His mansion was immaculate, run like a corporation. Every corner shone with order, every servant moved with discipline. And in the center of it all sat Alexander Grant, the untouchable billionaire, powerful, respected, feared. But if one looked closely, behind the cold facade and the endless wealth, there lingered a man desperately afraid of losing the only family he had left. The Grant mansion was a place where silence reigned. Footsteps were muted against the polished marble floors, voices were kept at a professional whisper, and every member of staff knew their place. It was into this carefully controlled world that Amora Johnson stepped one crisp autumn morning. At 28, Amora was not like the other women Alexander usually hired. She did not come from an elite domestic agency that boasted flawless resumes and pedigreed training. Instead, her profile was modest, too modest by Alexander's usual standards. Yet somehow, after a last-minute shortage and an urgent recommendation, her name had made it onto the list. Amora was striking in her quiet way. Her dark skin glowed against a neatly pressed uniform, and her eyes, warm, deep, and steady, seemed to carry stories that no one dared ask about. She moved with practiced grace, her posture humble, her speech respectful. Still, there was something about her that set her apart from the other staff. A kind of stillness that hinted at wounds from a past she chose not to speak of. Her duties were simple: maintain the east wing of the mansion, tend to the household's private quarters, and ensure everything remained immaculate. But Amora's gaze quickly wandered to more than just the dust on the shelves or the fingerprints on the glass. She noticed Chloe. The child was easy to overlook in such a vast, cold house. Though she had every luxury money could buy, Chloe's days were filled with silence, her tutors detached, her nurses efficient, her father distant. Amora saw it instantly, the way Chloe's eyes followed her when she entered the room, the way her small fingers fidgeted as though aching for someone to notice her, the way her smile, when it appeared, faded too quickly. One afternoon, while polishing the window near Chloe's study, Amora dared to speak softly to the girl. To her surprise, Chloe responded. Not with the stiff politeness she usually reserved for staff, but with a spark of genuine curiosity. By the end of the week, Amora had coaxed a shy laugh out of Chloe, something the other staff had rarely heard. But if Chloe's heart warmed, Alexander's remained cold. He watched the new maid with a calculating eye, his jaw tightening whenever he saw Chloe lingering too close to her. In his world, employees were meant to work, not to bond. Amora's gentle kindness might have touched his daughter, but to Alexander, it was a warning sign. And so, as Chloe's trust in Amora grew, Alexander's skepticism deepened. The morning began like any other in the Grant mansion, silent corridors, routine schedules, and the steady hum of order. Alexander had left early for a meeting downtown, or so everyone believed. The staff worked under the assumption that he would not return until late afternoon, which meant the atmosphere in the house was slightly more relaxed than usual. Amora had just finished tidying Chloe's study when she noticed the little girl sitting quietly by the window. The sunlight fell across Chloe's face, highlighting the sadness in her eyes as she stared at the garden where other children once played before her accident. Amora's heart tightened. She could see how desperately the child longed for something more than expensive toys and clinical caregivers. She longed for touch, for warmth, for love. Without thinking of rules or consequences, Amora knelt beside her. "You're awfully quiet today," she whispered. Chloe shrugged, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Amora's instincts overpowered her restraint. She reached out, and before long, Chloe leaned into her embrace. The little girl's small arms clung to Amora's neck, and in that moment, Chloe allowed herself to cry, softly, but freely, for the first time in months. It was a tender, healing moment. And it shattered within seconds. The door opened with a sharp click, and there stood Alexander Grant. His sharp suit contrasted the storm in his eyes as he froze at the sight of his daughter wrapped tightly in the arms of a maid. "What is this?" His voice was cold, cutting through the room like a blade. Amora quickly pulled back, startled, but Chloe clung tighter. "Daddy, please," she began, but Alexander's glare silenced her. His eyes bore into Amora with fury. "No staff member is ever to cross professional boundaries with my daughter," he snapped. "This is unacceptable. Completely unacceptable." Amora's lips parted, her heart racing, but words failed her. She wanted to explain that Chloe had needed comfort, that the child's tears had broken something inside her. But Alexander's anger left no room for explanations. "You think this is your role? To manipulate my daughter into clinging to you?" he accused, his voice rising. "I don't pay you to play family." Chloe burst into sobs, her small voice desperate. "No. She didn't do anything wrong. Daddy, don't take her away from me." Her tears soaked into Amora's uniform as she refused to let go. Alexander faltered for just a second at the sound of his daughter's broken plea, but his pride quickly stiffened his posture. He could not appear weak, not even in front of Chloe. After a tense silence, he spoke, his voice low and firm. "You will remain in this house for now, Miss Johnson. But hear me clearly, if this happens again, you're gone. No excuses." The warning hung heavy in the air. Chloe clutched Amora tighter, while Alexander turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing like thunder in the halls. The line had been drawn, and both women knew it. The days following Alexander's furious outburst were tense and uneasy. Staff moved quietly, sensing the heavy air that lingered in the mansion. But the greatest change came from Chloe. Once cheerful in Amora's presence, she now clung to her with a desperate intensity, as though fearing that at any moment her father would take Amora away. When Amora served Chloe her meals, the little girl ate. But if another maid brought her food, Chloe pushed the plate aside, shaking her head stubbornly. "I want Amora," she would whisper, her lips trembling. Tutors reported the same. Chloe responded only when Amora was in the room. Even bedtime was a battle. She refused to sleep unless Amora tucked her in with soft words and gentle reassurance. Alexander watched all of this with growing unease. He had always believed discipline and structure would keep Chloe safe, that routine would heal her wounds. Yet, as he stood in the doorway one evening, he saw his daughter laughing softly as Amora braided her hair, something no nurse or professional tutor had ever thought to do. The sight unsettled him. Chloe wasn't just fond of Amora. She was dependent on her. That realization brought back memories Alexander had tried hard to bury. 2 years earlier, the accident had shattered their lives. His wife, Eleanor, had been driving Chloe home from ballet class when the car spun out on a slick road. Alexander had arrived at the hospital too late to say goodbye. Eleanor was gone, and Chloe's spine had been damaged beyond repair. The vibrant little girl who once danced across the living room now sat in a wheelchair, her childhood cut short in an instant. Alexander had promised himself he would protect what remained of his family. But protection had become obsession. He built walls around Chloe, shielding her from risk, drowning her in comfort money could buy. Yet, all the wealth in the world couldn't replace what she had lost, a mother's touch, a mother's love. And now, Watching Chloe lean into Amora's embrace, Alexander felt something twist inside him. For the first time, his daughter was being given the one thing he couldn't provide: softness, tenderness, the very warmth Eleanor used to carry in her smile. Amora's presence filled the void in Chloe's heart in a way no one else could. She didn't treat Chloe like a fragile glass doll, or a patient confined to a chair. She treated her like a little girl, worthy of laughter, of comfort, of hugs. Alexander turned away before Chloe could see the moisture gathering in his eyes. He was losing his daughter, not to death, but to love, the kind of love he had never known how to give. And that terrified him more than anything else. Alexander Grant had built his empire on one core principle: control. He controlled his companies, his finances, his image, and most of all, his daughter's world. But Amora Johnson was the one element he could not control, and that fact gnawed at him with every passing day. Chloe's growing dependence on her was too strong, too consuming, and it unsettled him in ways he didn't fully understand. He began to watch Amora more closely. He noticed how she avoided certain questions about her past, how she always changed the subject when the other staff gossiped about their families or former jobs. She was too polished for a simple housemaid. Her grace, her composure, her quiet confidence, it was all too practiced. Something about her didn't add up. One late evening, Alexander retreated to his study. He opened the staff files, meticulously reviewing every line of Amora's application. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary. But as his sharp eyes scanned the page, the details began to unravel. Her employment history was vague, filled with gaps that didn't align with the timelines she had provided. The references listed were minimal, almost too clean. Alexander's suspicion deepened. He did not tolerate mysteries in his house. He picked up the phone and called in a favor, one of his most trusted contacts, a private investigator who had unearthed secrets for him in countless business wars. "Find out who she really is," Alexander ordered coldly. "Every detail. Leave nothing hidden." Days passed before the report arrived, sealed in a discreet envelope. Alexander opened it alone in his study, his expression grim as he read through the findings. The truth stunned him. Amora Johnson was no ordinary maid. She had once been a registered nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, the very hospital where Chloe had been treated after the accident. Alexander's hand froze over the page as he reread the line. It wasn't coincidence. She had been there. She had been part of those desperate hours that had changed his life forever. Why hadn't she disclosed this? The investigator's report raised even more questions. Amora had been a well-regarded nurse with a promising career, but 2 years ago, around the time of Chloe's accident, she had abruptly resigned. No official record explained why. There were whispers of a critical incident, though nothing was confirmed. Since then, she had vanished from the professional world, surfacing only in low-profile domestic jobs. Alexander leaned back in his chair, the weight of revelation pressing down on him. Was Amora here by chance, or by design? Did she seek out his household deliberately, knowing Chloe was inside? Was her kindness genuine, or was she attempting to atone for something darker? For the first time, the foundation of his carefully controlled life trembled. His daughter's laughter with Amora, her joy, her comfort, was all of it built on a hidden lie? Alexander closed the file, his jaw tightening. Whatever truth Amora carried, he would uncover it in full. He would drag every secret from her past into the light. Because in his world, there was no room for uncertainty, no room for trust without proof. And yet, beneath his fury, a chilling thought whispered in the back of his mind. If Amora had been there on the night of the accident, then she had touched Chloe's life long before he realized it. The discovery was shocking. But the unanswered questions were far more dangerous. The mansion was quiet that night, its grand halls cloaked in shadows. Most of the staff had retired to their quarters, but Alexander sat in his study, staring at the closed file on his desk. The investigator's report gnawed at him, the unanswered questions circling his mind like vultures. He could no longer ignore them. He needed the truth, directly from Amora's lips. He found her in the east wing, quietly folding linens in the servants' quarters. She startled when she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, his tall figure casting a commanding shadow across the room. "Mr. Grant," she asked softly, setting the linens aside. "We need to talk," Alexander said, his voice clipped, leaving no room for refusal. Amora followed him into the dimly lit study, her steps slow, uncertain. When he shut the door behind them, the weight of his stare pinned her in place. "I know who you are," Alexander began, his tone sharp. "You weren't just a maid looking for work. You were a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. The same hospital where Chloe was treated after the accident." Amora's lips parted, but she said nothing. Her silence was confirmation enough. "Why are you here?" Alexander pressed. "What are you hiding from me?" "From my daughter." Finally, Amora drew in a shaky breath. "I didn't come here to hurt Chloe. Or you. I came because I couldn't stay away any longer." Her eyes glistened as she continued, her voice trembling with the weight of memory. "I was there the night of the accident. Chloe was rushed into the ER. Her pulse was fading, her breathing shallow, the doctors weren't there yet. It was me who kept her alive long enough for the surgeons to take over." Alexander's expression hardened, but his chest tightened at the thought. "But I made a mistake," Amora confessed, tears slipping down her cheeks. "A small miscalculation in her intake chart. It didn't cost her life, but it could have. I couldn't forgive myself. I resigned the next day. I walked away from the career I had worked so hard for, and from Chloe." Her voice broke. "When I heard she survived, I thought my role was finished. But when I saw her again, broken and lonely, I knew I couldn't turn away. Not this time." Alexander's jaw clenched as silence filled the study. His instincts screamed to cast her out, to protect his daughter from any deception. Yet another part of him, the father, not the billionaire, recognized the sincerity in her voice. For the first time, Alexander saw Amora not as an intruder, but as a woman bound by guilt and redemption. And that unsettled him more than any lie. The days that followed their late-night confrontation left Alexander restless. He had demanded the truth, and Amora had given it to him. But instead of feeling satisfied, he felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath his carefully constructed world had begun to shift. Now, every time he looked at Amora, he saw her differently. Not just as a maid who had crossed boundaries, but as the woman who had once held his daughter's fragile life in her hands. He hated the thought that Chloe's survival had depended on her. Yet, he could not dismiss the undeniable truth. Amora had kept his child alive when fate was determined to take her. One afternoon, Alexander paused outside the sunroom, drawn by the sound of laughter. It was light, melodic, and achingly familiar. For a moment, his heart clenched. He hadn't heard that sound in so long. Peering in, he saw Chloe seated in her wheelchair, giggling uncontrollably as Amora gently tickled her side. The girl's face, so often blank with sadness, glowed with joy. Alexander froze. That laugh, it was Eleanor's laugh, a sound he thought had died with his wife. And now, here it was, blooming from his daughter again, drawn out not by him, not by wealth, not by doctors or tutors, but by Amora. The sight unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Chloe's happiness was undeniable, yet it came from someone outside his control. For years, Alexander had lived by order and dominance. He believed structure was the only way to keep his daughter safe. But in this moment, watching her eyes shine with life, he realized that his rigid rules had given Chloe everything except what she truly needed, love. That realization left him conflicted. Pride urged him to push Amora out, to prove that no outsider could succeed where he had failed. But his heart whispered otherwise. Could he really deny his daughter the one person who made her feel whole again? Later that evening, Alexander sat by Chloe's bedside as she drifted to sleep. She clutched the small teddy bear Amora had mended for her earlier. Even half asleep, she whispered Amora's name, smiling faintly. Alexander felt a pang of something sharp in his chest, a mixture of sorrow, guilt, and longing. For years, he had convinced himself he was enough. That his money, his protection, and his strict discipline would shield Chloe from pain. But tonight, he finally admitted what he had buried all along. He couldn't do it alone. He wasn't enough. The thought was unbearable. Yet, as he looked at his sleeping daughter, Alexander realized that love was not about control, or pride, or fear of loss. It was about giving her what she needed, even if it came from someone else. For the first time since the accident, Alexander Grant questioned the life he had built so rigidly. And for the first time, he began to wonder if letting go of control was the only way to truly save his daughter. It happened on a stormy night. Rain battered the mansion's tall windows, and thunder rolled in the distance like the growl of some restless beast. Chloe had always feared storms. Since the accident, the sound of thunder seemed to drag her back into the twisted wreckage of that night, to the screams and flashing lights of ambulances. Alexander was in his study, buried in paperwork, when he heard it, his daughter's terrified cries echoing down the hall. His heart lurched. He rushed to her room, his chest tightening as he flung the door open. Chloe was curled in her wheelchair near the bed, her small body trembling, tears streaking her face. "Daddy! Daddy, make it stop!" she sobbed, covering her ears against the crash of thunder. Alexander froze. His mind, sharp in the boardroom, was blank now. He knelt beside her, awkwardly placing a hand on her shoulder. "Chloe, it's just a storm. You're safe. Nothing will happen." His words were stiff, his voice unsteady. The more he tried, the louder Chloe cried, rocking back and forth as if the world itself was collapsing. And then Amora appeared. She had rushed in barefoot, her hair slightly undone, her face pale with worry. Without hesitation, she crossed the room and sank to her knees beside Chloe. "Sweetheart," she whispered, gathering the sobbing child into her arms. Chloe clung to her instantly, burying her face into Amora's chest. Alexander sat back, helpless, as he watched Amora soothe his daughter in a way he never could. She rocked Chloe gently, humming softly, her hands stroking the girl's hair with infinite patience. "Breathe with me, Chloe. In and out. That's it, baby. You're safe. I've got you." Slowly, Chloe's sobs quieted. Her breathing steadied, her small fists unclenching as Amora's warmth cocooned her. Within minutes, the trembling stopped. Chloe whispered, "Thank you, Amora," before closing her eyes, her body finally relaxing. Alexander's throat tightened. He had never seen his daughter comforted so completely, so tenderly. His wealth, his power, his discipline, none of it had given her what she needed. And here was Amora, with nothing but her arms and her heart, succeeding where he had failed. For the first time, Alexander felt something crack deep inside him. Vulnerability. The realization that all his strength and control meant nothing against his daughter's pain. He had failed her, not by neglect, but by being incapable of giving her what only love could. Standing in the doorway of Chloe's room, watching Amora cradle his daughter like a mother, Alexander finally understood the truth he had long resisted. Chloe didn't need a protector. She needed a parent. The whispers began quietly, as they always did in the circles Alexander Grant moved in. A hushed comment at a board luncheon, a knowing smirk at a charity committee meeting, a question disguised as idle curiosity. "Is it true the maid spends more time with your daughter than her governess?" At first, Alexander dismissed the murmurs. His empire had survived corporate scandals and ruthless rivals, he could endure gossip. But the rumors grew, spreading like wildfire among the high society elite who thrived on scandal. The story was simple, poisonous, and irresistible. The billionaire's maid was overstepping her role, becoming far too close to the fragile heiress of the Grant fortune. The final blow came at the annual Grant Foundation Gala, an event Alexander had hosted for years to showcase his power and benevolence. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and diamonds, laughter flowing with champagne. Every influential figure in the city was there, watching, judging. Chloe arrived dressed in a delicate gown, her hair braided neatly. She looked radiant, but there was fear in her eyes as she wheeled through the towering crowd. Her small hand clutched Amora's tightly, refusing to let go. "Sweetheart," Alexander whispered, bending low, "perhaps it's best if Amora joins the staff table. Tonight is—" "No," Chloe said firmly, her voice trembling. "I want her with me." The refusal was loud enough to turn heads. Murmurs rippled through the guests, their gazes flicking from Chloe's frightened eyes to the dark-skinned woman standing at her side. A maid in uniform at the billionaire's table, it was unheard of. Improper. Unacceptable. As the night unfolded, Alexander felt the sting of every stare, every forced smile concealing disdain. One woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, not softly enough, "His letting the help play mother. How pitiful." Another guest chuckled under his breath, "Imagine, a billionaire's daughter clinging to a maid." And though no one said it outright, Alexander knew the undercurrent well, prejudice. Not just against Amora's position, but against her very skin. To them, she would always be less than, no matter her kindness or dignity. Alexander's pride screamed at him to correct the situation. To separate Chloe from Amora, to reassert control, to silence the whispers before they grew into scandal. His reputation had been built on strength, untouchable authority. Allowing her, to stand by his side was an invitation for ridicule. But then he looked at Chloe. At the way her small fingers tightened around Amora's hand, her knuckles pale with fear at the thought of losing her. He saw the silent plea in his daughter's eyes, begging him not to take away the one person who made her feel safe in a room full of strangers. In that moment, Alexander felt torn in two. On one side was the iron grip of reputation, the cold world of wealth and power he had built. On the other was his daughter's fragile happiness, fragile but real, something he hadn't seen since Eleanor's death. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Grant did not know which world he belonged to. The storm broke not in public, but in the hushed intimacy of the Grant mansion, when Alexander demanded to know the full truth. The tension between them had reached its breaking point, rumors swirled, Chloe's dependence deepened, and Alexander's pride could no longer allow unanswered questions. Amora stood in the quiet of the library, her hands trembling as she folded them before her. The grand room's shelves loomed around her like silent judges, but it was Alexander's piercing gaze that cut the deepest. "No more half-truths," he said, his voice sharp but low. "I know you were at the hospital. I know you left nursing. What I don't know, what I need to know, is why." For a long moment, Amora's lips trembled with words she had buried for years. Finally, she drew in a shaky breath. "Because I failed her." Alexander stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Failed Chloe?" Amora nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I was one of the nurses on duty the night of the accident. The trauma unit was chaos, your wife was being rushed into surgery, Chloe was unconscious, bleeding heavily. I was assigned to monitor her vitals. And in those frantic moments, her voice cracked. I misread a monitor. I didn't see how close she was to crashing until it was almost too late." The memory was a knife twisting in her chest, but she forced herself to go on. "By the time I realized, Chloe's heart had slowed. The doctors hadn't yet arrived. I panicked. I thought I had killed her. But then, something in me refused to let her slip away. I performed chest compressions, bagged her, and screamed until the trauma team rushed in. She lived, by the grace of God, and because I didn't stop fighting." Amora's tears spilled freely now, her voice raw. "But the mistake haunted me. If I had noticed sooner, she wouldn't have been on the brink. I couldn't forgive myself. I resigned, vanished from that life. I took whatever small jobs I could, housekeeping, caregiving, cleaning, anything to stay away from a hospital. I told myself I didn't deserve to wear a nurse's badge again." She sank to her knees, her head bowed. "When I applied here, I didn't know it was your house. I didn't know it was her. Not until I saw Chloe's face. And then, I knew fate had given me another chance. Not to replace her mother. Not to take anyone's place. But to give her the care I almost cost her. To make amends for my failure." Her voice shook as she whispered the last words. "I never wanted to cross lines, Mr. Grant. I only wanted to give her the love and safety she deserves, because I couldn't live with myself if I turned away again." Silence stretched heavy in the room. Alexander, who had built his empire on control and certainty, now found himself shaken by the weight of her confession. He saw not manipulation, but guilt. Not ambition, but a woman broken by her past, clinging to redemption through his daughter. For the first time, Alexander realized the truth. Amora wasn't stealing Chloe's love. She was giving back what she believed she had stolen years ago. The mansion's walls, once symbols of Alexander's wealth and power, now echoed with a tension he could no longer ignore. Amora's confession lingered in his mind, gnawing at him with a weight he didn't know how to carry. He believed her sincerity, yet the scandal already brewing outside these walls, the whispers of society, and his own pride pushed him toward a choice he hated to make. That evening, he summoned Amora to the study. She entered with lowered eyes, bracing for what she seemed to know was coming. Alexander stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the dim light of dusk. He couldn't bring himself to look directly at her. "You have been more than a maid to this household," he began, his voice controlled but cold. "Too much more." And now, your past, your closeness with Chloe, it's become something I cannot contain. Society won't forgive it. They'll say I allowed a servant to overstep. They'll say I'm weak. His tone cracked ever so slightly. For my daughter's sake, for my family's name, you must leave. The words struck Amora like a blow. She didn't argue. She only pressed her lips together, nodded once, and whispered, I understand. Her quiet acceptance only made his chest tighten more. But Chloe heard. She had been listening from the hallway, her small hands clutching the railing. When she realized what her father had said, she rushed forward, her face pale with panic. No, she cried, throwing her arms around Amora. You can't take her away. She's mine. She loves me like Mommy did. Alexander froze. The words pierced through him deeper than any accusation from the outside world. Chloe's voice shook with desperation as tears streamed down her face. I won't eat, I won't talk, I won't do anything if she goes. You don't understand, Daddy, she makes me feel safe again. When Alexander reached for her, Chloe jerked away, running upstairs. The slam of her bedroom door rattled through the mansion like a final judgment. Minutes later, the sound of a lock clicking shut echoed, sealing her away from him. Chloe! Alexander called, his usually commanding voice breaking into raw fear. He pounded on the door, but she refused to answer. In the suffocating silence that followed, Amora stood in the shadows, tears slipping down her cheeks, torn between obeying Alexander's demand and the sound of Chloe sobbing behind the locked door. Alone in the hallway, Alexander leaned his forehead against the wood, haunted by his daughter's words. For the first time, his wealth, his reputation, his power, none of it mattered. All that remained was a child's broken voice echoing in his mind. She loves me like Mommy did. Alexander Grant spent the night in silence, his empire of steel and glass feeling more fragile than ever. The study's fire had long since burned out, leaving only the bitter taste of ash in the air. He hadn't closed his eyes once. Every time he tried, Chloe's voice rang in his ears, she loves me like Mommy did. He sat with a tumbler of untouched whiskey in his hand, staring into nothing. The image of his late wife flooded his mind. He remembered the last time he held her hand in the hospital, her voice faint but firm, promise me you'll give Chloe love, not just protection. At the time, Alexander thought wealth, security, and control were love enough. But he now saw how hollow that promise had become. Protection had built walls around Chloe, but love had never entered them. Not until Amora. The realization unsettled him. Amora had broken every rule of his world, his rigid boundaries, his demand for professionalism, his obsession with appearances. And yet, she was the only one who had given Chloe what he could not, a mother's embrace, unconditional affection, the freedom to laugh again. As dawn broke, Alexander rose from his chair and walked the empty halls of the mansion. Every room echoed with the sound of Chloe's absence. She hadn't come out since locking herself in. He paused outside her door, hearing only silence where her laughter should have been. His heart clenched. For once in his life, Alexander stopped thinking like a billionaire, a businessman, a man concerned with reputation. For the first time, he thought only as a father. Later that morning, he instructed his driver to bring Amora back. The staff exchanged nervous glances. No one dared question him, but the tension was palpable. When Amora returned, her eyes were red from sleeplessness, her posture tense as though expecting rejection all over again. Alexander met her at the entrance. For a moment, neither spoke. His pride wrestled with the words he needed to say, but Chloe's desperate cries echoed in his memory, breaking down his resistance. I was wrong, he admitted quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of decades of control finally cracking. You've given my daughter what I could not. And no amount of wealth or reputation can replace that. Chloe needs you, and so do I. Amora's eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief. She had prepared herself to walk away forever, but not for this, never for this. From upstairs, a sudden sound broke the silence, the creak of a door opening. Chloe appeared at the top of the staircase, her face pale, eyes swollen from crying. When she saw Amora standing there again, she didn't hesitate. She rolled forward in her wheelchair, her voice breaking with joy. You came back, she cried. Amora dropped to her knees, embracing Chloe as tightly as she could. Alexander stood back, watching, his chest heavy with a mix of humility and relief. For the first time in years, the mansion no longer felt like a prison, it felt like a home. The whispers of high society were inevitable. Alexander Grant had always been a man scrutinized for his choices, his fortune making every move a headline. But this time, the scandal was not about a merger or an investment, it was about a maid who had become more than staff. At the next charity event, Alexander faced the storm head-on. He arrived with Chloe and Amora by his side, his hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. When a well-dressed socialite muttered within earshot, "How disgraceful, parading the helper's family," Alexander stopped in his tracks. "Amora is not the help," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the hall. "She is the woman who saved my daughter's life, who gave her back the will to smile again. If you cannot respect her, then you do not respect me, or Chloe." The room fell silent, the sting of his words cutting through the polished arrogance of the crowd. Some guests averted their eyes, others whispered all the more. But Alexander no longer cared. For the first time in years, he felt free from the weight of their judgment. Chloe clung to Amora's hand, beaming up at her father with pride. The glow on her face had returned, her laughter soft but steady, her panic attacks fewer and farther between. Doctors noticed improvements in her health, but Alexander knew the truth. Love was her greatest medicine, and Amora had delivered it selflessly. In the weeks that followed, the mansion shifted in atmosphere. What once was cold and silent now echoed with small joys, Chloe's giggles in the garden, Amora's gentle singing in the kitchen, Alexander's rare but genuine laughter joining theirs. The bond was fragile, tested daily by memories of loss and the scars of the past, but it was real. At night, Alexander would sometimes find himself watching Chloe and Amora together, his heart stirring with something unfamiliar, hope. Redemption had not come in wealth or control, but in acceptance. He had nearly lost it all by clinging to pride, but now he understood, family was not defined by titles or appearances. It was defined by love. And at last, they had found it again. The whispers of high society were inevitable. Alexander Grant had always been a man scrutinized for his choices, his fortune making every move a headline. But this time, the scandal was not about a merger or an investment, it was about a maid who had become more than staff. At the next charity event, Alexander faced the storm head-on. He arrived with Chloe and Amora by his side, his hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. When a well-dressed socialite muttered within earshot, "How disgraceful, parading the helper's family," Alexander stopped in his tracks. "Amora is not the help," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the hall. "She is the woman who saved my daughter's life, who gave her back the will to smile again. If you cannot respect her, then you do not respect me, or Chloe." The room fell silent, the sting of his words cutting through the polished arrogance of the crowd. Some guests averted their eyes, others whispered all the more. But Alexander no longer cared. For the first time in years, he felt free from the weight of their judgment. Chloe clung to Amora's hand, beaming up at her father with pride. The glow on her face had returned, her laughter soft but steady, her panic attacks fewer and farther between. Doctors noticed improvements in her health, but Alexander knew the truth. Love was her greatest medicine, and Amora had delivered it selflessly. In the weeks that followed, the mansion shifted in atmosphere. What once was cold and silent now echoed with small joys, Chloe's giggles in the garden, Amora's gentle singing in the kitchen, Alexander's rare but genuine laughter joining theirs. The bond was fragile, tested daily by memories of loss and the scars of the past, but it was real. At night, Alexander would sometimes find himself watching Chloe and Amora together, his heart stirring with something unfamiliar, hope. Redemption had not come in wealth or control, but in acceptance. He had nearly lost it all by clinging to pride, but now he understood, family was not defined by titles or appearances. It was defined by love. And at last, they had found it again.